What is up, my peeps? What is up, Miss Hamilton? We're going to be doing the Russia term list, content-specific vocabulary only. Russia. Starting off with the political ideologies, communism. What is it? Why is it important, right? So communism is just this really idea of like state-owned property where each person works and is just, paid by the government. And this idea was really just taken by Vladimir Lenin and used in the Soviet Union and really built upon. And it's still really prevalent today in Russia, even though, their current government is still like, they call it democracy when it really isn't. But all of these ideas are still really held in communism and this idea of like centralized power. And it just has influence in their political culture to this day. Next, socialism. What is it? This is another thing that was used by Vladimir Lenin, like really influenced during the Soviet era. And it's this idea, it's kind of like communism, but the next level, where you have complete government oversight over basically everything, the economy, everything is redistributed equally in their eyes. And how does that relate to Russia? Again, this was more of this like Soviet era where all these ideas of remain in public expectations and all this government provided stuff is just like really their focus point. Next, complete opposite end of the spectrum, right? Let's say we have all our political ideologies here, fascism, all the way over here, right? Fascism is a far-right authoritarian ideology with dictator power, and its relation to Russia is really just seen through how these leaders actually use their power. And I would argue that they all use this, like, they use fascist, like, ideals in their way of governing, but they're doing it in the eyes of communism, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Moving right along to the electoral party and systems. What does that say right there? The party system. Russia has a dominant party system where one, which is United Russia, has remained dominant for the last 20 years under Vladimir Putin. But essentially, it's just this one party that has just really swept through, and we're going to talk about why. Starting off with single-member districts, which is really just electoral districts that elect one representative, and half of Russia's State Duma, which is their lower house of their representative thing going on, we'll talk about that, the seats are picked through single-member districts, and that can really favor a large, well-resourced party that is United Russia. And moving right along to multi-member districts, similar, kind of the exact opposite, not really similar. Basically, multiple representatives can be elected in these districts. And these are really not a part of Russia. It's more their cousin, which is called proportional representation. And that is actually seen in half of the State Duma, as that's how they're chosen, and that's how these seats are being picked. So, moving right along. The first past the post system. What is it? It's a single member district system where the candidate with the most votes wins, period. None of this, even if they don't have a majority, most votes, you're in, right? How does Russia use it? Again, in that State Duma, and how they favor this United Russia party through these the majority wins type, like archetype, basically. Now, two-party system, pretty self-explanatory. It's just the system that's dominated by two major parties. And how does it relate to Russia? It's, not really here. It's more just to show how Russia has a dominant party system. And yeah. So, constituency service. That is this idea of how efforts by elected officials help individual constituents with government services or like problems. So, like, while that does exist in Russia, it's less emphasized because of all this, like, centralized power and this, like, weak kind of local accountability. So that all that kind of gets, pushed aside. Next, runoff elections. It's when a second election is held because no candidate has the majority, in that first round of voting. And runoff elections can occur in local or regional elections, but are not typically used for national level, elections. And that's kind of that's all they're really seen in Russia. Dominant party system, again, it's just that system where we see with United Russia how they've last 20 years, they've just been sweeping the charts, all the records. And yeah, so again, the exact opposite is the multi-party system, where multiple political parties have the capacity to gain like control of these government offices. And the only really example I can think of is like this idea of like proportional representation, where all the other parties get like those like little spots. So party discipline, what is that, right? That's when these party leaders like they ensure that the ideals of the party are actually being met, like regardless of like, let's say I was for United Russia, even if I personally am like, I don't really like support this idea, because of the party, I would vote towards that idea. That's kind of what that is. And Russia has this culture of like really strong party discipline. And that's how all this like legislation is passed under the executive branch and whatnot. Moving right along to the political actors and institutions. United Russia is this dominant party led by Putin, and that's basically all you need to know. Social movements are just like how like the people kind of speak their mind, basically. And social movements really don't thrive in Russia, mainly because of all this like corruption again, and like all this like government repression towards almost just the freedom of speech in general, basically. And what is the pluralist system? That right there, my friends, is a system where multiple independent groups compete to influence policy. Now, Russia doesn't really have that, because all of these like independent civil society groups are really just constantly berated by Russia and all of their like government like oversight kind of, so you don't really see a lot of that. A corporatist system, however, is a system where the state formally like partners with certain So sorry about that, y'all. We had a Father Palmer interruption, I believe one of many. So, corporatist systems. It's a system where the state formally like partners with certain organizations and interest groups to shape certain policies. So basically, like, Russia has elements of this like state corporatism, where the government only recognizes these like loyal organizations and like suppresses all these like independent ones, because like we don't need those, right? So single peak associations, right? Interest groups that represent a sector and are officially recognized by the state. These are these like loyal ones we were just talking about, where like these like state-backed labor unions that are used by Russian government to manage like these interest group activities, basically. It's just another way that they can like oversee everything, basically. So moving on to the actual structure of the government, right? You have the president, and you have the prime minister. Prime minister is the head of government appointed by the president, like handpicked and confirmed by the Duma. Now, the Duma can say, whoa, I don't like this guy. Get him out of here. They can do that 3 times, but after that, the president can see what's up, and like he can completely get rid of the Duma entirely and just a whole nother batch of people. That's kind of like a checks and balance system, but it's really favoring the president, because he can just keep picking these guys and they have to do this whole restructuring if 3 of them happen. So the prime minister really oversees the cabinet, but operates under the strong influence of the president. He's kind of just like, we've seen it how Putin gets reelected by being appointed as a prime minister, and then he steps down, replaced, boom. So that's kind of how that works. Now, the State Duma is the lower house of Russia's parliament. Now, it passes legislation, it confirms every prime minister, or else it'll get. And it is dominated by United Russia. Now, the Federation Council, however, is the upper house of Russia's parliament, and it represents like regional governments, basically. That's the most broad way of explaining it. Cultural and ethnic groups. The Russian Orthodox. The primary religion that just dominates Russia, and it's closely tied to their national identity and promotes all these nationalist like views that you see in the Russian people. And it has strong ties to the state historically, as other religions have been suppressed throughout their entire history, and it's really just the dominant national identity. And then you have the Chechens, or the Chechens, I'm gonna call them, right? They were this group that were ethnically in the like certain section of Russia, and they, after the World Wars, they were like, yo, I want independence, right? I want to. Russia was not having that. So there was a series of wars fought over in the early 1990s, and they lost. They got their butts whooped, and they are now governed by a loyalist regime, but tensions still kind of remain over like if Russia was right about that. And we kind of see that now with Ukraine actually, because it's like still a pretty big deal, right? And it just shows their like how they're manipulating not really like human rights, but they're just like they're not doing too good. You know what I mean? But that is going to do it for Russia. Thank you, Miss Hamilton. That's 2 credits, 2 of many.